Hello and welcome to this video on ethnicity, crime and justice. There are differences between ethnic groups with regards to their prevalence within the criminal justice system in the United Kingdom. There are also differences between ethnic groups with regards to the risk of being a victim of crime. So depending on your ethnicity, you're either more or less likely to be within the criminal justice system, that is, as either a victim or else as someone who's been prosecuted for having committed a crime. And as sociologists, we want to know why. Firstly, we can look at official statistics to help us understand what's going on a little bit more. In the UK, we generally find that black people and Asians are overrepresented in our criminal justice system. Blacks are 2.8% of the overall population of the United Kingdom, but 11% of the prison population. Asians are 4.7% of the overall population, but 6% of the prison population. White people, however, are underrepresented. They are 7 times less likely to be stopped and searched than blacks, and 3.5 times less likely to be arrested, and 5 times less likely to be in prison. So what we see here is a bit of a misnomer, something that's sort of difficult to understand when we look at our demography and then we look at our prison population, trying to work out why is it the way it is. Official statistics can only give us the numbers, they don't really give us the why, so we need to dig down a little deeper. Secondly, therefore, sociologists may decide to use victim surveys. This is where they ask people what crimes they have been a victim of, and this may give us more detail on why we see this over/underrepresentation within our prison population, our criminal justice system, amongst certain ethnic groups. What we find is the victims can then identify the ethnicity of the perpetrators, so that is the people who've committed a crime against them. What we find when we look at victim surveys, such as the British Crime Survey, is that crime is often intra-ethnic. So, 90% of the crime where the victim was white, one of the perpetrators was also white. So generally speaking, it would appear that people commit crimes against people of the same ethnicity. It is intra-ethnic. However, we tend to find also that victims often over-identify blacks. Could be a whole range of reasons for this. Could be because of labelling within the media. Could be because of underlying racism. They also only cover personal crimes, so crimes against an individual, your individual person, of which only 1/5 of all crimes are actually personal crimes. They also exclude under 16s, so minorities actually contain a high proportion of younger people, and so therefore that's going to warp the data. And it also excludes crime against organisations such as white-collar crime, so crime by the middle classes. Thirdly, instead, sociologists may decide to use self-report studies. These ask individuals to disclose anonymously their own dishonest and criminal behaviour. Graham and Bowling found that black and whites have a similar rate of offending, around 43%, whilst Asians have lower rates. Sharp and Budd found that those from mixed ethnic origins were more likely to self-report their crimes, and there may be a whole range of reasons why this might be the case. So 27% of males of mixed ethnicity claim to have used drugs in the last year, compared to just 16% of black and white males. Whites, roughly 6%, were more likely to use Class A drugs such as cocaine and heroin, rather than blacks at 2% and Asians at 1%. So again, quite interesting statistics, but perhaps we need to take them ever so slightly with a pinch of salt. The findings of self-report studies challenge the stereotype of black people as being more likely to offend than whites, but uphold the stereotype of the law-abiding Asian. But self-report studies could be flawed. A whole range of reasons. It could well be that some people decide to over-represent their own crime, that is, make out that they're doing more crime than they really are, whereas other people may decide to keep it to themselves because they may not trust that the survey actually is anonymous. The discrepancy between official statistics and self-report studies makes it hard to draw definitive conclusions on ethnicity and crime. So this is why we're going to have to bring in a bit of sociology to find out really what's going on. It's useful to look at the whole criminal justice system and to consider it step by step and consider to what extent racism may play a role in over-representing ethnic minority groups. When it comes to policing, so the act of police being out there, bobbies on the beat doing what they have to do, since the 1970s there has been a persistent claim of oppressive policing of ethnic minorities. So leaders of ethnic minority communities have often gone on record in the media and said that actually the way the police behave towards ethnic minorities is oppressive. They tend to overuse stop and search against those of ethnic minority extraction, in particular young black men, and they often use military policing. This is where they flood an area where a particular ethnic group is considered to live in large numbers and essentially sort of spy on and surveil people who live in that area because they don't trust them. In terms of stop and search, police only require what is known as a reasonable suspicion to stop and search someone. And we tend to find that blacks are stopped more often than whites. Now, obviously, there's an issue here with that concept of reasonable suspicion because it's very subjective, it's very personal. Every single police officer will have their own idea of what is reasonable in terms of suspicion. However, since the Terrorism Act of 2000 and since the terrorist acts of the last 20 years or so, the number of Asians stopped has increased. This could be a product of police racism. Very famously, the Macpherson report that came out in 1999 after the death of Stephen Lawrence, it was an investigation into that, said that actually the Metropolitan Police was in fact institutionally racist, that the way it behaves is actively racist, and that amongst the rank and file members of the Metropolitan Police, so the average Bobby on the beat, there was a canteen culture of racism, so people making racist jokes and engaging in their policing practice in a racist manner. In terms of explaining this further, it could also be a product of ethnic differences in offending, but we need to consider the difference here between low and high discretion stops. So a low discretion stop is where the police act on intelligence. So the police have been tipped off, such as a description of the offender. So someone has done something, someone's called up and said, some of my property has been stolen, this is what the offender looked like. If the police see someone who looks like that description, they'll stop and search them, and that's acting on intelligence. That's a low discretion stop. A high discretion stop is when the police act without intelligence. That is, they do it based on kind of their own thoughts and feelings, their own ideas. And it's in this type of stop that we tend to find that discrimination is more likely, because if the police are harbouring sort of racist ideas or stereotypes or prejudices, this is where it's going to come out. However, the reason for stop and search could be a product of demographics. So those who are young, the unemployed, manual workers and urban dwellers, that is city dwellers, are more likely to be stopped regardless of ethnicity. And we tend to find that we have more younger, unemployed, manual workers who live in cities amongst ethnic minorities. So it might purely be a product of numbers, or it could be a product of racism. There's a debate here to be had. The next step in the criminal justice system is arrests and cautions. Figures in England and Wales show that the arrest rate for blacks is 3.6 times the rate for whites. By contrast, once arrested, blacks and Asians were less likely than whites to receive a caution. One reason for this may be that members of ethnic minority groups are more likely to deny the offence and to exercise their right to legal advice. However, not admitting the offence means they cannot be let off with a caution and are more likely to be charged instead. So what we have here is that often when whites are arrested, if they have committed the crime, they're far more likely to say, do you know what, I committed the crime. And what often happens is the police go, well, obviously depending on how severe the offence is, we're going to give you a caution and let you go. Those from black, Asian, minority ethnic backgrounds often do not trust the police to actually pursue justice fairly. And so if they have committed the crime, they're far more likely to deny it, and they're far more likely to ask for legal advice. As a result, the police cannot issue a warning, and so it has instead to move on to an arrest, which obviously means it's going to become far more serious, and the likelihood of prosecution and ultimately punishment increases. In terms of prosecution, the Crown Prosecution Service, or the CPS, is the body responsible for deciding whether a case brought by the police should be prosecuted in court. Studies suggest that the CPS is more likely to drop cases against ethnic minorities. Bowling and Phillips argue that this may be because the evidence presented to the CPS by the police is often weaker and based on stereotyping of ethnic minorities as criminals. So what's interesting is when the police do decide to prosecute, say, a member of a black, Asian, minority ethnic community who supposedly committed a crime, the CPS often look at the evidence and go, do you know what, there's not enough evidence here. And so instead you brought me a case based on some stereotypes or some prejudice. And so it gets thrown out. Often with a white individual who's being prosecuted, there's often a bit more evidence. And so the CPS actually take it to the next stage. Next, we need to think about trial. When cases do go ahead, members of minority ethnic groups are more likely to elect for trial before a jury in a Crown Court rather than in a magistrate's court, perhaps due to mistrust of magistrates' impartiality. However, Crown Courts can impose more severe sentences if convicted. So, if you are prosecuted, if the CPS say yes, you get given a choice. you can either go to a magistrate's court or a Crown Court. In a magistrate's court, there's going to be 3 magistrates and no jury, and they're going to decide whether or not you did in fact commit the crime. And if you did, obviously they'll punish you, but the punishment is much lower in terms of what they can hand out. Whereas if you go to a Crown Court, we tend to find those from black, Asian, minority ethnic backgrounds trust Crown Courts more because they think, well, I'm going to be tried in front of a jury of my peers. I've got a better chance of pleading to them and maybe being let off. They're more likely to trust that system than trust judges and lawyers and solicitors and so on and so forth. And so when they do that, if they are found guilty, we tend to find the punishment is higher. And so there's a problem or a discrepancy here between different ethnic groups. In terms of convictions, it is therefore interesting to note that black and Asian defendants are less likely to be found guilty. In 2006-7, 60% of white defendants were found guilty, as against only 52% of blacks and 44% of Asians. This suggests discrimination in that the police and CPS may be bringing weaker or less serious cases against ethnic minorities that are thrown out by the courts. In terms of sentencing, custodial sentences, that is, going into prison, going into custody for a period of time, were given to a greater proportion of black offenders, 68%, than whites, 55%, or Asian offenders, 59%, whereas whites and Asians were more likely than blacks to receive community sentences, which are generally considered more lenient. This may be due to differences in the seriousness of the offences or in defendants' previous convictions. However, a study of 5 Crown Courts found that even when such factors were taken into account, black men were 5% more likely to receive a custodial sentence on average 3 months longer than white men. So if you are black and you are male, you are generally going to prison, receiving a custodial sentence, for longer than any other group within the criminal justice system. In terms of pre-sentence reports, one possible reason for harsher sentences is the pre-sentence reports written by probation officers. Hudson and Bramall argue that PSRs allow for unwitting discrimination. They found that reports on Asian offenders were less comprehensive and suggested that they were less remorseful than white offenders. They place this bias in the context of the demonising of Muslims in the wake of the events of 11th of September 2001, or 9/11 as it's referred to colloquially. So what we're seeing here is, before sentencing takes place, a probation officer has to put together a pre-sentence report, which goes to the magistrate or to the judge, who's then going to read that and work out what type of sentence to hand down. If it says, well, generally this person seems remorseful, they worked with the police throughout all the processes, they gave up evidence willingly, the chances are the sentence will be much more lenient than if it says, well, actually this person isn't remorseful, this person didn't really cooperate and so on. And we generally find, again, there's an ethnic dimension to this or a racist dimension to this that we need to be aware of. In terms of prison, in 2007, just over a quarter of the male prison population were from minority ethnic groups, including 15% black and 7% Asian. Among British nationals, 7.4 per thousand black people were in jail compared to 1.7 per thousand Asians and 1.4 per thousand white people. As such, blacks were 5 times more likely to be in prison than whites. Black and Asian offenders are more likely than whites to be serving longer sentences. Within the total prison population, all minority groups have a higher than average proportion of prisoners on remand, that is, awaiting trial. This is because ethnic minorities are less likely to be granted bail while awaiting trial, that is, allowed out to be in the community before they actually come to trial. Finally, we can note the existence of similar patterns in the US, where 2 out of 5 prisoners held in local jails are black, while 1 in 5 are Hispanic. So now we have the statistics and we have looked at a bit of a breakdown of the criminal justice system and what's going on at each stage, and thought about the role that racism may be playing in the discrepancy between individuals of different ethnic groups within it. We now need to consider how we can go about explaining differences in offending, if indeed there are differences in offending. First generation immigrants from the 1950s onwards in the UK were primarily from the Caribbean and the Indian subcontinent, and generally we found that these groups had a lower rate of offending than average. By the 1970s, however, conflict had begun to spark between the police and African Caribbean individuals or individuals from that community, and this led to a fear of a rise of black criminality. So it's often suggested that actually whilst the first generation of immigrants were very law-abiding, the second generation perhaps were not as law-abiding, and it may well be that actually the first generation put up with a lot of racism when they first arrived in the UK, but the second generation, having been born in the UK, were unwilling to do so, and that might be one of the reasons why we see this spike in criminality amongst, in particular, blacks, but also other ethnic minority groups. By the 1990s and 2000s, there was a rise of the fear of Asian gangs, clashes between Asian youths and the police in the wake of Islamist terrorist attacks, and there's been a fear of the enemy within. And again, the media have played a key role in this, but subsequent governments have also often fostered this idea and empowered the police almost to act upon these kind of ideas as well. With regards to theoretical explanations for ethnic differences in offending, left realist Leon Young put forward the idea that blacks do have a higher crime rate because of their level of relative deprivation, marginalisation, social exclusion and alienation. So the argument here is, as a community, this group is more relatively deprived, so they are aware of their deprivation vis-a-vis other groups. They are more marginalised and socially excluded, so they are pushed to the margins of society. They are overlooked by political leaders and policymakers. They are voiceless in many regards, but also alienation. They feel disconnected perhaps in the world of work or disconnected from others within society. This appears to refute the level or effect of police racism. So Leon Young are effectively saying this is not really a police racism thing, it's because this particular group is suffering from these various different issues, and actually that's why they commit more crime. As looking at differences in black and Asian stop and search figures, it would seem to imply the police are highly selective in their racism, which is unlikely. So what Leon Young say is, well, if the police are racist, why are they only stopping that particular ethnic group and not other ethnic groups? If that was the case, there's a bit of a selectivity here in terms of their racism, and generally racists aren't selectively racist, they are racist in a blanket sense. Therefore, there must be real differences between these groups and their levels of deprivation and so on. However, it could be that the rates may be lower for Asians, not because they are less likely to offend, but due to police stereotypes. So perhaps the police stereotype blacks as aggressive and Asians as passive, and so therefore are less likely to stop and search or investigate Asians versus blacks. However, as stated before, this may be changing since 9/11 and the rise of Islamist terrorism within the West. Another theoretical explanation we might want to pull upon to explain ethnic differences in offending is the work of neo-Marxists such as Paul Gilroy and Stuart Hall. They would argue that statistics do not accurately reflect reality, but are a social construction that stereotypes ethnic minorities as inherently more criminal. So they would be arguing here that generally who is producing these statistics? It's going to be the bourgeoisie or their various tools of state, the various different apparatus of state, in particular within the RSA, if we want to pull upon a bit of Althusser. Paul Gilroy said that black criminality was a myth, that ethnic minority crime is a form of political resistance against the imperialism of the past and the racism of the present. So what Gilroy was saying was when blacks are engaging in any criminality, it's not actually criminality, it's essentially civil war, that they are fighting back, they are engaging in a revolutionary act against the imperialism of the past where white empires from Europe went and conquered other parts of the globe and enslaved black minorities or black groups, and also the racism of the present, which we've discussed previously. However, as we know, first-generation immigrants were law-abiding, therefore it's unlikely the colonial struggle was passed down. One would expect instead that it would be purposely not passed down. Moreover, crime tends to be intra-ethnic, so the biggest victims of black criminality tends to be members of the black community themselves. Stuart Hall and others said that the moral panic over rising crime by ethnic minorities serves to distract attention away from the crisis of capitalism. So actually, this is the way of the bourgeoisie saying to the workers, to the proletariat, of which ethnic minorities are a part of, don't think about the fact that capitalism is exploiting you. Don't think about the fact that you are being constantly used as a form of wage slavery. Don't think about the fact that the bourgeoisie are growing fat on your labour. Instead, focus on each other and focus on racism, focus on crime amongst yourselves, and that will prevent the proletariat forming class consciousness and aiming their ire at the bourgeoisie and capitalism in general. However, In terms of criticisms, this does not show how the crisis of capitalism leads to a moral panic specifically, and left realists would say that reaction is not in fact panicky but real, and that it's kind of makes sense to be panicked in the face of overwhelming crime statistics. We now need to consider ethnicity and victimisation. There's been increased focus today by sociologists on the racist victimisation of ethnic minorities within our society. Racist victimisation is when an individual is selected as a target because of their race, ethnicity or religion, which is quite broad. Rather than having a very specific focus on just race, we have also ethnicity and religion. It's worth mentioning that Stephen Lawrence's murder in 1993, whilst obviously it was at the hands of a particular group of racists, was often considered, or is considered as a result of the Macpherson report, to be the outcome or the product of failures by the police, which was motivated by racism also. In the British Crime Survey, we find these crimes categorised as racist incidents. This is when an incident is perceived as racist by the victim, and racially or religiously aggravated offences. This is an assault or whatever type of crime it might be, by someone motivated by hostility towards a certain race or religion. So two different names for essentially the same concept of racist victimisation. The police recorded 54,000 racist incidents in England and Wales in 2014-15, but much is believed to be unreported. The British Crime Survey estimates that there were in fact 89,000 racist incidents, so there's a big difference there, and the sheer number of these incidents gives way to this idea that actually we have a bit of an issue with regards to racism in the United Kingdom. 38,000 racially or religiously aggravated offences occurred in 2014-15, and 8.6 thousand people were prosecuted or cautioned. So it's unlikely that that is all of the people who engaged in these activities. So again, we've got this idea that many people seem to be getting away with it. People from mixed ethnic backgrounds have a higher risk of being a victim of crime, 27.9%, more so than blacks, 18%, Asians, 15.8%, and whites at 15.7%. So certain groups are far more likely to be a victim than others. Now, the differences in these statistics on victimisation may be partly due to also being young, male and unemployed, because we tend to find that those who are young, those who are male and those who are unemployed are far more likely to be victims than other groups in our society. If there are therefore more of these types of people in your group or in your ethnic community, there is a higher chance of victimisation therefore. So again, it could just be a numbers game, but of course racism appears to be a stronger argument here. Members of Black, Asian, minority ethnic groups often coordinate their responses to racist victimisation. We found in the past that they have engaged in things such as fireproofing their doors and letterboxes to prevent far-right groups from pouring petrol through letterboxes and setting fire to it, for example. Self-defence campaigns have been put together to help those who are elderly in those communities prepare themselves just in case they should be attacked. Even physically defending their neighbourhoods. So a number of years ago, when we had the riots going on in parts of London, but also parts of the UK in general, for that week, we had Sikhs coming out onto the streets in various parts of the UK, engaging in kind of foot patrols to defend their area and defend their livelihoods and their shops and so on, because they didn't want them to be caught up in the riots. Now, this should be understood in light of what is known as the underprotection by the police. So it's the idea that when the police are deciding which areas to police, which areas they're going to protect, as it were, where they're going to be putting their bobbies on the beat, they may decide actually not to protect the areas where they know there are large numbers of ethnic minorities. And this, again, could be potentially motivated by racism. The 1999 report into the Stephen Lawrence case found evidence of professional incompetence, institutional racism, and a failure of leadership in this regard. That's it. Thank you very much.